I'd like to invite Amit Pinchevski, who will chair our first panel with our keynote speakers, Dr. Noah Shenker from Australia and Professor Dan Leopard from California, with a 17-hour difference between them. So just a few words about Amit. He's associate professor in the Department of Communication and Journalism at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. His research interests are in theory and philosophy of communication and media, focusing specifically on the ethical aspects of the limits of communication, media, witnessing, memory and trauma, and pathologies of communication and their constructions. All these are very related to our topic, and his recent book, Transmitted Wounds, Media and the Mediation of Trauma, from Oxford University Press. I'll just say that in 2012, he was the recipient of the James Justice Hollerwood Award from the National Communication Association Ethics Division. And other things to acknowledge that you can read also in the invitation that you received. So I'm happy to pass on the Zoom to Amit. Thank you, Amit, and thank you, Noah and Dan.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Hadass, for the introduction. I'm very happy to be here with all of you and to introduce our guest speakers and say what you will about Zoom. This is the only situation in which we can have an intercontinental conference covering most of the earth, really, right? From California via Israel to Australia. So this is also a technological feat, not only an intellectual one. So thank you for joining us from the two far ends of the world. And we invited both of you to give a talk which we thought would be, which would touch specifically some of the core issues that many of us are thinking about and dealing with when we, in our studies, in our work on the possibilities and challenges of witnessing and Holocaust testimony today and in the future. So I'll just introduce our speakers and we'll open the stage for them. And afterwards, we will have enough time to have a conversation with them and continue a discussion. Our two speakers are, as Hadass already mentioned, Dr. Noah Shenker and Dr. Dan Leopard. Dr. Shenker is the 6A Foundation and Milgram Senior Lecturer in Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Monash University at the Center for Jewish Civilization. This is in Melbourne. And he's the author of a well-known book, Reframing Holocaust Testimony, and several articles and chapters on the topics of representation of the Holocaust through, among other things, film, testimony, and new media. And he's now working with Dan on Beyond the Era of the Witness, the Digital Afterlife of Holocaust Testimony. And Dan is Associate Professor of Media and Visual Studies at St. Mary's College in California. And his book, Teaching with the Screen, Pedagogy, Agency, and Media Culture is published by Routledge. And in addition to working on this new project with Noah, he co-authored the book. He's currently working on a book on a visual essay on the intersections of memory, mothering, and the mummy complex. That's a triple M project. So I'll leave it to you now, and we'll be back to meeting together after the talk. Thank you.
All right. Let me just get to full screen here. Okay, so first off, I'd like to thank Hadass for this warm invitation to attend and present at this conference, to the organizers of this conference, and to Amit for the wonderful introduction and for agreeing to moderate and share this discussion. So here, just if anybody has any kind of follow-up questions or queries, want to reach out to Dan or myself, our emails are below. Dan and I first encountered Pinchas Gutter in May of 2016. He had taken up a new home within the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., occupying a corner of its Wexler Learning Center. Now, unlike the miniature 18-inch version of him that we had met twice before at the offices of the Shoah Foundation at USC, where both Dan and I did our doctoral work, the version of Pinchas that we encountered at the museum sat unassumingly before us on a screen 3/4 of his actual height. And unlike in earlier installations, he can now respond with 50,000 unique answers, up from the 25,000 unique answers he could provide earlier that year. So this is both just give you a sense of this corner of the Wexler Learning Center, and there's some video embedded, which I'll show you, but just a few quick comments about the Wexler Learning Center, which is located, for those of you who have been to the museum, just outside of the permanent exhibition there. And was designed, of course, to be an interactive pedagogical space, a space where museum planners envisioned kind of interactive encounters with facets of Holocaust history, largely through testimonies that were curated around certain thematic points. We found Pinchas situated in a temporary exhibit in that space. And upon entering the cordoned off area, we encountered a Russian middle-aged Jewish woman, an immigrant to the United States, who was serving as a docent, but sounded in many ways like a carnival barker. Dan and I remember hearing her say, "Come see the 21st century technology that brings testimony. It's done for the future generations who won't be able to communicate with survivors in their physical forms," quote unquote. She's instructed to read off a script to provide context for what was then the New Dimensions in Testimony Project, otherwise known as NDT, which has been changed over the last few years to the Dimensions in Testimony Project, or DIT. She's been instructed to read off a script to give audiences a sense of the technology. Now I'm going to show you, so basically there's a desk on which sits a clicker. There's the screen in front of the desk, and the docent in this instance doesn't field the questions, but rather demonstrates to the users how, and that's a term, by the way, whether we refer them as users, as audiences, something that we can discuss more after our presentation. What is the proper term to describe here those who are engaging with this technology? So here is one instance. I took this footage, and I apologize. I did study cinema studies at USC, but I did not study cinema making. And so that will be clearly reflected in my composition here. So I'm going to just...
Can you tell us about your story? I have no idea where you came from, your upbringing, what happened in the beginning, and how did it affect you? How old were you when it all started to change?
I'm 8 years old.
See, some what we should do, make sure. What happened to you in the beginning? Tell me your story.
Is it difficult to tell my story to you? It's difficult, but it's also cathartic and gratifying. So it is, it's two faces. It's two things. It's both difficult and important. It's also very important to share my story with you, because I think it's very important to be able to overcome and avoid doing it's possible that you know what happened to be able to avoid it. And you have to be able to bring some goodness into yourself and allow the goodness that is inside you, because we all got the understand. We've got continuous life between the good angel and the bad one, the one that pushes you, toward doing bad things, and the one that pushes you toward doing good things. So we have a constant fight. It started already in the womb of and she had Eliza and Shenker, and the Bible tells you the two of and they were fighting in her womb. So these two souls were already fighting inside her womb.
Just a few points before I hand off to Dan that I wanted to pick out. One is when we first encountered the DIT technology, then the NDT technology, and Pincus was on a screen 18 inches in height. In spite of or alongside the imperfections of the technology, the failures of the vocal recognition software, the inability for Pincus to pick up on questions about what was like life in Lodz, where he was from, or to use the Polish pronunciation Łódź, there was, in his failure to pick up on that, in spite of or alongside those failures, we found ourselves feeling at least the effect of being, and this will speak back to Amit's work, in the presence of someone giving testimony, in the presence of a living testifier, the effect at least of that. And yet at the same time, the technology was incredibly messy, incredibly imperfect. As you see here in this clip, you cannot have a conversational exchange or a dialogue with Pincus. You need to ask very concise, compact questions. And even when you get answers to those questions, they're often mismatched, or if they don't appear to be mismatched, they might seem to be of a kind. That is, answers that seem to be a match with, generically speaking, with the kind of question that you've asked, but not the precise question that you've asked. And so those are some of the observations I wanted to just point out. The fact that there's still a lot of work and mediation that's still required on the part of the docents to kind of direct and redirect the users in this instance. So Dan, I hand it back to you.
Yeah,
I'll stop sharing.
Let me share my screen and I will get moving. Thank you. I want to say, first of all, thank you to everybody. Am I being registered here? Yeah, okay. Thank you everybody for inviting me. I appreciate it. It's a great privilege, actually, I must say. Great to be here. So I have slides I want to show, so let me share those. I have to bring them up on my iPad. Let me just get them real quick. They should show up now. There they are. So let me just do that. Okay, so I want to explain a little bit about my role in this. I'm not a Jewish studies scholar or a Holocaust genocide scholar, but I am a communications scholar. And I'm really interested in the communicative aspect of this. In fact, when Noah and I first started talking about this project, I was actually including it in the, as Amit said, the 3 M's project, which really deals with the notion of trauma around media and the way in which media and parenting sort of takes on a certain valence in relation to the way we look at media. But anyway, so I want to start with, like Noah kind of gave a setup here, but I want to talk a little bit about what we're doing so you understand how we're approaching this particular media object. So Pincus Guter to PG, and the reason we say that is we have sort of designated the simulation as what we call Pincus DIT, which is dimensions in testimony, because I think it's really important that we understand that there are distinct entities here. Because one of the things about the simulation is that it takes on human characteristics, and we too, having experienced it in different sizes, which I'll show in a second, we give it agency, we give it human attributes. even though we know it's a simulation, we know it's a construction via editing and stuff. So what we're doing is I really want to make sure that we draw a distinction between Pinchevski, the man, who's an actual living human being, right? And the various iterations of him in various mediated forms. So this is Pinchevski, excuse me with the thing here, Pinchevski in the video testimony from 1995. This is him in the recent DIT, the simulation. He's obviously aged, but he's also high resolution. This is the room in which he was captured, like the actual, they now use a different rig. They have a little portable thing. They've been going around the world. The Shoah Foundation has been going to Australia recently, because it is difficult for people to come, and it takes 5 days of this for Pinchevski, and it's, it takes stamina and etc. Anyway, so this is a room. It's those are lights you're seeing in the background, but you're also seeing cameras in there. They're embedded. And so although all the versions that we've looked at and all the versions you have available to you right now are really two-dimensional, they do have the data that they could, at some point when the technology gets to that point, that they could actually have a more realized virtual figure. But right now it's two-dimensional. I just think it's interesting because, so this gentleman here is Pinchevski, the human being, standing next to Pinchevski, DIT, the simulation. So what I do is I actually write, but I also am a artist, cartoonist of sorts. And one of the things I'm interested in is the subjectivity that sort of is given to these. There's more of them now. There's Pinchevski as a sort of pilot project, but there's a lot of them now. They have like 26, I may be getting the wrong number, but 26 or 27, maybe up to 30 of these virtual humans that they've created, their simulations. And so early on, I was referring to them as virtual humans because that's my background with which you'll see in a second, with the Institute for Creative Technologies, which is the group that kind of created the technology that allows for Pinchevski, the simulation, Pinchevski DIT, to exist. And the first thing I said was virtual humans, and one of the makers of the simulation said, no, it's actually Pinchevski, he's alive, which obviously echoes Frankenstein and Gollum and all these kind of figures that have come to life, which I think's not true, but I think it's actually very interesting that that's the same way they conceptualize it. So going from that, what you see when you see the simulations is that they have to hold very, very rigid, because otherwise the editing process by which it looks seamless will be disrupted. So they have to only have certain hand gestures and movement. But I thought to myself, well, since I'm a cartoonist and I'm really interested in the idea of drawings that activate life and sort of bring to life, that we could sort of expand Pinchevski out into the world further. And so what we're actually talking about is a simulation. So none of these drawings are of Pinchevski, the actual human being. I respect his entity as a human living person. But I am sort of trying to extend out the idea of what the simulations bring to the audience. And so these are just some examples of the basic iteration. So there's, on the left here, we have Pinchevski, the human being, born in 1932. We have Pinchevski DIT, who's the simulation that appears on the large flat. And he was born in 2014, I believe, actually, but we saw him first at 2017. And then this is my caricature / drawing of Pinchevski, which we call PG, which is a critical cartoon, which is basically the idea of the visualization of this gentleman. And so the first version we saw, well, actually, I believe that I might have been solo on this one, but at one time I saw him on a laptop. Another time we saw him 18 inches tall. And then he's also installed in the hallway of the Shoah Foundation as a full-size figure. And he's also installed in museums, sometimes even larger than a full-size figure. But each of those different iterations have a different feeling about them. And I actually found the laptop one to be quite intimate. Like, he was this little guy talking to me, and as, I don't know if you catch my vocal patterns, but he has a hard time understanding me. And so it was this very frustrating, but also very intimate relationship where we tried to talk. Anyway, so there's that. Let me just go to the next one. So I just want to quickly tell, we were discussing this, and one of the things we're interested in is where does Pinchevski fits into the sort of history of witnessing testimony, but also how does he fit into the notion of the virtual human, which is, he definitely is like a signature event. In fact, just last night I was at I was at a dinner party and I mentioned this and somebody said, oh my gosh, I saw that on 60 Minutes, right? So this project is kind of disseminating in a very popular framework right now. So anyway, so talking a little bit about forerunners of this, and I'm kind of interested in these figures. So back in the 1700s, there was this duck that was made, that was a mechanical duck. And actually what you could do is you come in, it's about this big, and then you feed it a pellet. And then the pellet goes through the duck's digestive system, which is depicted here. And then it poops at the end. It drops out a little thing that looks like so it's basically a mechanical reproduction of what's a biological system, right, at some level, which is, in a way, the database behind Pincus is exactly that, except I would argue that it's a electronic version of a consciousness, which we'll get to later. But anyway, go back to this real quick. So our duck, which is this little guy, they actually refer to as the defecating duck in the literature. You know, he eats these pellets, and then he has this biological process. And then some of you might be familiar with the Edgar Allan Poe story of Maisel's chess player, which is also called the Turk. It's this like robot, supposedly, that can play chess. And, you know, turns out actually that most likely it was a little person inside that was pulling the levers, kind of a classic carnival / circus trick. And then I'm very interested in this. I'm sure you've all heard of the animatronic Disneyland Abraham Lincoln that stands up and goes 407 years ago. So this is an example also of the sort of clockwork person, right, that has these mechanisms that run this, you know, personality. This is just a photo of one of the versions of the Maisel's chess player. So there's a space down below here is really where they think a person was probably sitting and doing the actual calculations on the chess plays. Anyway, jumping ahead much time. In the 1960s, there's this program called Eliza, which is key to what we're talking about. It was a text-based program, and it's a psychotherapist. And it's based on Carl Rogers' idea about psychotherapy, which is that if you just simply let the person talk, ask a few questions, then the subject of the therapy will actually come to some understanding of their own situation, right? The interesting thing about that is it's simply a line of text, but that the text elicits in people quite quickly that they reveal personal details, they get really into it, and they start feeling like they're talking to a person, even though all you're seeing is a line of text. It's like a prompt, like you would have on an old school computer. This is Weissman talking, working on his computer. This is the one he used to do it. And this was really kind of a version of the Alan Turing's idea about is there artificial intelligence? If you believe the person on the other side is human, then that's kind of a test of intelligence. A couple of other things is when I was in Singapore at the Asian Civilizations Museum, they had these docents that each one was culturally specific to, I think it was 5 or 7 basic cultural groups that were in Singapore. And each one, as you walked up, there was this screen that had a face on it. This guy's holding a mask up in front of his face, and he takes it down and talks to you. And as you walk forward, there's an activation sensor that the person starts talking to you on the screen, and they explain to you what you're going to see in that particular room, which struck me to be very much like Pincus's setting. And then the final thing, as far as other outside things, there's this thing called Baby X, which is in New Zealand, which is a baby that has actually been designed to grow, mature, develop on the screen. This is like my version of the toddler, kind of maybe a little bit older. And like this person's here is showing a sheep card, sheep, and the baby says sheep, right? And recognizes the sheep on the card. So I think that's another aspect of what the Pincus simulation kind of echoes, or in the case of Baby X, presages, right? I mean, this baby is already now, I think it's I think it's like in its tweens. Maybe. Anyway, they keep re-rendering it so it gets older, and it's supposedly the database underneath keeps learning more and more, which is what Pincus does, actually, by the way. Anyway, so the Institute for Creative Technologies is where Pincus, his ancestors, live. This is a virtual human who was meant to train people on Navy submarines. a lot of the funding at the Institute for Creative Technologies is funded by the what is the Defense Department? This was the Navy. By the way, I don't know if you saw that back there, but there was, where'd it go? Oh, this. So this is my rendering of that. So the thing about Steve, which is that little floating guy, his main thing is there's a red button and it says, do not push the red button. I never got an answer to what that meant, but I always kind of envisioned it. If you push that button, the submarine would explode. So Steve floats around saying, don't push the red button, but he tells you other things as well. Anyway, back to this real quick. Sorry, that was a digression. Anyway, so this is very much like a Pincus Guter, Pincus DIT. Let me use the nomenclature. This is Sergeant John, and I actually saw this in person. This is a warehouse in Marina del Rey near the beach in LA. And this is a full-size person. You walk up and you can talk to him. The thing about it is interesting is he's, you know, a military officer. He's supposed to be commanding troops, and he has a very canned set of things he can say. So like if you walk up and ask him questions, the person on the left is one of the ICT people that producer, actually, I believe. And they kind of feed questions to the simulation, who then talks back to you, right? In the same setting, if you notice, there's walls look like a cave. There's also like a sort of desert scenario. And as you're walking through, people jump out and kind of aim guns at you, and you have to decide whether or not it's a person that's a friend or a foe. Though tellingly, on the bus over to this warehouse, there was a colonel for the US military, I believe he's Army actually. And he said, the number one problem we have isn't like who to shoot. The problem is how to talk to people. And he said the cultural interaction is the part that we have to train. And so he was really big on having these things do that, which I think is interesting, that this technology around war ended up being the sort of foundational technology for Pincus. One of the things they do, which is a parallel strain, is they've been designing virtual therapists, particularly around PTSD, since they have a military orientation. This is an example. I have a video of this, but I'm not going to show it. It takes too long, and you get the gist of it from here. The gentleman on the left is actually an ICT employee, and they're mapping his face. And as he moves, they can see his affect. Like, he looks up, it means one thing. And they have this affect mapping, which you see there about the gaze, attention, body activity. And then you see the therapist on the right, which is called Sim Sensei. And she has a great thing at one point where he's not really talking. She goes, where are you from? And he goes, oh, I'm from Los Angeles. And she goes, oh, that's funny, I'm from Los Angeles too. Like this affective connection that she's trying to reach with the person to get them to say more about their issues, right? We'll get to Sabine later. Anyway, so that's the kind of the basic thing that Pincus arises from, kind of a foundational set of technologies. And the Shoah Foundation, which is also housed at USC, where the ICT, the Institute for Creative Technologies, is housed. They're actually, one's in Marina del Rey, but one's on campus. But that technology is ported over. In that first shot I showed you of Pincus in the room with all the lights around, all the cameras, that actually is at the ICT. And that's actually the technology they use from there. And it costs in the neighborhood of, Noah, correct me here, but I think it was $2 million was the original Pincus. What was that?
2.5.
2.5. But now I think they've gone it down to hundreds of thousands, like with the rig they use to, so they create a smaller rig, but still it's based on this technology. And in the book that Amit mentioned, I have a chapter on their technology. This has been going on since the early 90s, as far as the military funded equipment. In fact, at one point they got, I think, the largest donation ever to a US university from the Army to develop these, the original technologies around combat and deployment. Anyway, I want to make one note, since it does relate to Pincus. One of the things that was also said was the technology the Army wanted to develop was something that you could do reconnaissance in the morning. You could then train people in the afternoon, or develop a simulation in the afternoon, train people in the evening, and then go to combat in the morning. And I think that's interesting that technology then gets deployed into something like the DIT, the Dimensions of Testimony. So I will hand it back to you, Noah, correct?
Yes, I'm going to just transition. This is very awkward. I'm just going to transition to my laptop because my second. Okay, hold on 1 second. Just because can you hear me? Okay, great. Sorry, apologies. My dongle just ran out of batteries. So I'm going to share my screen again, and so one of the things that we started to do work on was, after encountering Pincus Pincus DIT in his interactive form, we went back to excavate his testimonies throughout the course of actually what was decades, starting as early as 1993, all the way up to, of course, 2014, when he began the process of giving testimony, giving an interview for the DIT project. Now, like all of the witnesses, over 25 witnesses who have been rendered as virtual humans for the DIT, each and every one of those, at least in the case of Holocaust survivors, had first been recorded through the Shoah Foundation's Visual History Archive. So they had to have given testimony first on videotape, most likely during the 1990s, most commonly during the 1990s. And Pincus was no different. He had given his testimony in 1995 to the USC Shoah Foundation in Toronto. After leaving Poland, he went to Israel and South Africa, and then into into Canada. And I'm going to just show you a clip of testimony from that 1994 interview.
And they, in kind of one fell swoop, you were turned over, and you were kind of become part of some kind of a bestiality, treated like a beast, worse than a beast. And I think it was from that time on that I started retreating into myself. And I became almost like this video machine. I became a onlooker and recorder of events that was happening. And also, I think that the experience, that first experience of being subjected to this kind of inhuman behavior somehow insulated me for the future. In other words, I was like inoculated to a certain extent, because I was 7 and I was given this burst of bestiality in a very concentrated form. So what happened later, which was far, I mean, unbelievable horror, but it somehow did not have that shattering effect, because the shattering effect was done previously. That was the beginning of it. And there was a continuous degradation. But the continuous degradation was, I had some defense. And so you were out.
Now, this is an important point. Pincus is articulating something here, and whether or not what he's articulating was true then to his experience of how and what he witnessed to what he is recounting now is something that we can discuss. But what's important is that in this particular testimony, he, in concert with the interviewer, is very much focusing on a notion of his detailed videographic memory, a kind of memory that validates him as being reliable, seemingly objective, one who is above all else recording in order to survive and surviving in order to record. He looks back on his past seemingly with a large semblance of emotional and bodily remove, commenting on experiencing life before and during the war was almost like filming. And in the process of filming, his, quote, subconscious doesn't allow him to have feelings, unquote. He mentions the time in Warsaw following his move from his hometown of Lodz. Quote, I think that the experience of being exposed to inhuman behavior somehow insulated me, as he said. Goethe presents himself as someone who, through his exposure to horrors in the ghetto and a shock to his system early on, which in his words, as he said, inoculated him from being shattered by his later separation from his family in Majdanek and their eventual deaths. Although Pinchas DIT presents Guter sitting still in his chair, framed from head to toe, this 1995 video testimony is framed in the common medium close-up composition. And I would argue, though maybe not so much in this clip so much, but is a much more animated figure, though the range of his movement needs to be largely implied through off-screen space. There is a vocal as well as physical gestural range of expression, which is far more expansive that we found compared to Pinchas DIT. His eyes are front and center to the frame. We're able to see him contemplate and assess the questions being asked of him. We are caught by his gaze as he ruminates. Although there's a lower resolution, it's a grainier image. The video image is a dirtier image. In contrast to the razor sharp fidelity of the DIT, there is something about the videographic image of Pinchas, which compared to the DIT rendering carries a valence of authenticity. So after having viewed this testimony and engaging with the Pinchas DIT at the Shoah Foundation, we actually were provided with the entire transcript of Pinchas DIT, or let's say Pinchas Guter's interview that rendered him into Pinchas DIT. Over 400 pages of over 2,000 questions with tags in the margins for placing into the AI as well as machine-driven system, and manually driven system, the precise points of and Dan will speak more to this about how to harvest these questions for users. But again, I want us to just focus on this idea of his eyes as lenses. He focuses yet on this idea, on one hand, of being a reliable witness, so someone who remembers things in the great amount of detail. At the same time, there are certain images that he cannot capture. There are certain images that he simply cannot recall. One that Dan will speak to that haunts him by his own admission to this day. But this actually gets back to Dan's invocation of the Torah Test. There are multiple questions throughout the interview process, as evident in the transcript, where Pinchas is asked to attest to his reliability and to his authenticity. Questions about, when you're giving me answers, are you giving me honest answers? That's literally a question. When I'm asking you these questions, are you giving me honest answers? Or, quote, when you reflect on the past, do you think that you remember things accurately? In both instances, Guter insists that he would never say anything that is untrue, that he, quote unquote, abhors dishonesty, and that even since his time in childhood, he has always been careful to separate that which he heard firsthand, that which he heard or saw firsthand, and that which he heard or saw secondhand. The questions are geared in over 2,000 questions on establishing Guter as a dispassionate, reliable recorder of events, positioning him as a flesh and blood human being who can transcend the realm of the virtual. The world in which Pinchas DIT lives, the construction resulting from the motion capture interview process, is situated in such a way as to make him as reliable as possible. And thus, there was even this early investment in promoting him as a hologram. He's not a hologram. He is rendered in 2 dimensions. There's nothing 3-dimensional about Pinchas DIT. There is the theoretical potential of his data being rendered through holographic means of representation down the line, but that has never been the case with any of the survivors, any of the virtual avatars. But this investment in holography, in the discourses, I should say, rather than the practices of holography, I'd argue is steeped in this idea that of all the technologies, to harken back, of course, to USC, to George Lucas, the paterfamilias of USC, a graduate and major donor to USC, this idea of holography as representing the most authentic form of visual representation, harkening back to Star Wars. So he thus is situated as this bridge between the fragility of the passing of survivors and the tension and apprehension and anxiety around new media. I won't, I'll just cut out some things here, other than just to stress, for sake of setting up what Dan will be talking about. Let me just,
And they,
is that he also gave testimony in 1993 to the Newburgh Holocaust Education Center in Toronto, where he lived. And even though this was only 2 years before the 1995 interview, there's a vitality about him, a youthfulness about him that doesn't come across in the DIT rendering. Not, of course, his age would explain that, but I think there's also something about the setting, something about the intimacy of the setting in his adopted hometown of Toronto. Now, granted, he had developed a relationship with Stephen Smith, the executive director of the Shoah Foundation, who conducted the interviews with him in 2014. But by the time we encounter Pincus in 2000 for the rendering in 2014, when we first see him in 2016, 2017, he's become the sage witness. He has become a witness who has given his story time and time again. I was even talking to Yoav earlier, who said that when Pincus attended or gave a talk at a conference recently that Yoav was a part of, that he commented on the kind of lack of emotive range that was available to him through the DIT rendering process, as opposed, and I apologize if I'm putting words in Yoav's mouth, and he could comment on that, as opposed to other forms of giving testimony. But something that comes across, and I just want to set this up for Dan, is this memory of his sister, probably next to two other images, maybe three, the most central figure in his testimony throughout. And again, even that term, the slippage between interview and testimony, is, I'm not as interested in whether or not this is a work of testimony, but more in terms of, and I think we can certainly discuss that, and I think it's germane. But I think the question for me is the centrality of Sabina, his sister, his twin sister, who he lost in Majdanek. She was killed in Majdanek. And in this interview, and in the 1995 interview, and in the DIT interview, and every interview that he has given, including in his memoir, is the film The Last Goodbye, the virtual reality film The Last Goodbye, produced by the Shoah Foundation, Sabina is a central, if not an iconic figure. He says, quote, "I find it difficult to talk about my sister more than anybody else." He claps his hands together, a gesture, by the way, that, as Dan alluded to, wouldn't be allowed within the context of Pincus DIT. He says, quote, "I'm not sure why, but it's possible because she was my twin. It was almost like we were the same person." Fidgeting with the cuff of his right sleeve, he says, "But I find it difficult to come to terms with the memory of my sister. There are a lot of things I don't remember. There are lots of things I do remember, and lots of things I would like to remember, but they are shut up in my subconscious," unquote. He then remarks on the fact that the only thing he does remember is her braid, the golden plaits and the ribbons that kept them in place. She was very proud of her hair, she said. There's an immediacy and sense of rawness that comes through here, perhaps owing to this being his first formal video testimony, more than the polished yet constrained version of the DIT. He is not yet that sage witness I alluded to. And I think that's something that when we get to our conclusion in the not so distant future, we can kind of underscore. So Dan, I hand it back to you. Let me stop sharing my screen.
Okay, let me share mine real quick. I got a couple of visuals to go with this. Let's see, share. Let's do that. Okay. So this is the visual I came up with that I think visualizes to some extent what's going on with this, but I have a text I want to read. So more than any other figure in Guter's interview for the DIT and for his archived video testimonies that came before that, his twin sister Sabina is the most referenced person from his past. Having been separated from Sabina and his mother at Madonic, never to see her either again, there's a lacuna in Guter's recall. He is unable to remember her physical appearance other than her blonde braid, which is not blonde here, but it is here. It is precisely this inability to envision her more fully that undermines his insistence that he has a video camera. In the DIT transcript, which by the way runs 450 pages long, so it's quite a bit of material, Smith asks a series, Smith is the director of the Shoah Foundation who does the interviewing, which probably most of you have heard of, asks a series of questions encouraging Guter to relate memories of his sister, including, what is it that you remember most about your sister? And Guter responds, quote, I remember in the Warsaw ghetto where vermin and lice were so common, you couldn't run away from them. So my mother wanted to cut my sister's hair because her hair actually was very long right back to her backside. And she always used to plait it, and my sister wouldn't let her. And I remember, of course, the last time when I saw that plate, when she was hugging my mother. So those are things that I actually remember, but I don't remember her. I remember things of her hair. Guter's recollection of his sister's lice infestation blends into his memory of his sister and mother being separated from him at the camp, and then to the memory of her hair. But in recalling his sister, he is also bringing back a memory of his mother. This story of remembering and forgetting is not simply about his sister and her braids, but also about what he remembers of his mother. In that sense, his sister serves as a screen memory, one that can only be analyzed through its multiple repetitions across the larger constellation of his DIT interview, which, by the way, it comes back and forth. And the Shoah Foundation makes a point of this has actually become sort of a brand almost, which is sort of strange, but still this idea of a braid. This is my rendering of it, but there is this sort of, there's a version they did that's like become the every place I will look for the Shoah Foundation and talking about the DIT, this braid comes up again. So I thought I'd do my own version of it. A little more fantastic.
Sorry, Dan, I'm sorry to interrupt you. If you could just please talk a little louder or closer to the microphone.
Sorry. Sorry. It's still early in the morning here in LA. Okay. Furthermore, the Shoah Foundation, in its anticipation of future uses of the interface as a pedagogically useful tool, asked Guter repeatedly about his sister and tags his responses in the system's programming accordingly. In one instance, they listed as important memory of his sister. Now I've got top of my head cut off. Okay, there we go. Either the voice or the head, can't have both. In a later question about whether or not Guter ever saw his mother again after she was led away, he remarks, I never saw my mother after that image that I've got in my mind when Sabina runs and hugs her. My mother looking down upon her, and then the women were made to march or disappear. And even if they didn't, I just lost complete track of them. And yet Smith presses Guter for the impossible recall of his sister's face. And doing so lifts it out of the wider context of his memories of his mother and his family. Sabina's occluded image is central to Guter's framing of his memories as it is interwoven, like her plaits of hair, into the larger story about the loss of his mother and the world in which he was raised. The Shoah Foundation has at points emphasized Sabina's hair and Guter's loss of her memory as keys to understanding his testimony. But in so doing, it also highlights the precariousness of his claims to camera-like verisimilitude of recall. It perpetuates and focuses on Sabina as a lost memory while displacing the active loss of his mother as well. Smith directly addresses this displacement, although perhaps unintentionally, by one point querying, do certain memories haunt you? And again, Guter replies that he cannot get over his inability to remember his sister. The golden plates represent as much the love and care his mother showed towards him and his sister as it does the pain of losing them both. Given the repeated references throughout Guter's interview to the golden plates and the failure to recall his sister's face, this lapse seems to construct to a great extent the ways in which Guter narrates his past. But Guter's narratives, stories that have been polished over time through retelling, should not be understood as simply contradicting his account of himself as a camera, as a recording self. He has memories of her, but they are symbolized at the level of occlusion. His twin sister's hair, the loss of his family. Key narrative components remain: the golden plates, the lice, and the love of their mother. But Sabina is missing. She is not represented mentally as a tangible image, yet the collective sensations, the narrative fragments, serve to create a cognitive emotional map of her and her meaning for Guter. She represents his loss. Guter has key memories of her, just not visual representations accessible to recall. We want him to paint a picture. That picture is largely missing. What is present is narrative, and that narrative represents displacement. And that's the reason I read that is that's key to the sort of final thing that we want to talk about, which is the idea that the database, which is constructed from these 450 pages of testimony, is, I think, actually a consciousness. Like this idea of you've created a sort of, like we do in the narrative where we read books and we think, oh, this really represents somebody's thought patterns or something. I think the database, although it has these sort of lapses and displacements, actually does to a great extent represent a version of this man who's actually has these memories and actually does have these, like, you know, occluded images of the past but he keeps referring to himself as a video camera, which is kind of an interesting twist on the fact he also keeps saying how he can't recall. Anyway, we'll get to that in a second. I'm going to switch it back to Noah for his part.
Okay, and I'll just kind of, I won't say gloss over, but kind of compress and condense for the sake of time, which is to say that the final time, well, not really, one of the final times that we encountered Pincus was in 2000, Pincus DIT, I should say, was in 2018. He had initially been on display at the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York by himself. And interestingly, it was adjacent to a temporary exhibition on Lodz. And so I thought, okay, well, this is great. I can now reapproach him and talk to him about Lodz. He wasn't able to answer those questions before, given that there's a special exhibit on Lodz during the Holocaust adjacent to this hall where Pincus is giving his testimony. I asked him, so can you tell me about Lodz? Now, he still couldn't answer that question, which gets us into something which is the more, and Dan can speak to this as well, is the more times you ask, the more frequently asked the question, the more the system, whether through manual human programming and artificial intelligence programming, directs you, points you towards a question that is either of a kind or a partial or complete match with the question that you asked. And that matches the question that Stephen Smith had asked of Pincus. And so questions about Lodz just don't feature into those word bubbles, if you will. Questions about his sister, questions about death camps, questions about experiences of extreme loss, of tragedy, or about having met Hitler, questions that are seemingly off topic or not within the range of his own experience are more frequently asked, and as such get directed accordingly. And it was interestingly that after a year or so after Pincus was displayed on his own, he had some company in the form of Eva Schloss, the former stepsister of Anne Frank, and she gives her. You enter in this room. There's a podium with a mouse, and a microphone, and you can choose to ask a question of either Pincus or of Eva. Now, we hadn't gone to see Eva, as we were writing only at that time about Pincus. And I engaged with Pincus, and Pincus had, in spite of his inability to talk about Lodz, had, in fact, he's up beyond 100,000 unique answers. He is a fluid, not completely, and there's still, in fact, far from it. There are great lapses. I can show you. Here's a question I asked him about regret, which is interesting. Pincus, do you have any regrets?
I don't think so. I can't think of any.
Pincus, do you have any regrets?
I don't think Thanks for running. Midnight.
Now, I could show you more of that clip, but the funny thing is he answers those questions, two questions that I asked him, both correctly. First, he says, no, not that I can think of. So if you just left it at that, I happen to have known the interview. I knew the transcript. I knew that because Stephen Smith had prompted us when we first encountered Pinchas DIT, you should ask him about his regrets. And so I did. And his regrets were about not being able to recall the image of his sister. His second answer picks up on his sister. His first picks up on a generic question of, oh no, not that I can think of, which is actually incorrect because of course you can think of regrets. It's harvesting an incorrect answer. And yet, in that moment where he talks about his sister, it's incredibly powerful. I felt obliged, much that you could see, by the way, and I think this is really important from the clip that I showed from the Holocaust Museum, where that woman is not, she's displaying the nodding, the fixed eye contact, even during points when he's speaking Hebrew and she's nodding as if perhaps she understands. I didn't, my parents are probably weeping over the 12 years of Hebrew that I took that I didn't, understand what he was saying. I apologize to the audience and to my hosts and to my father-in-law who's Israeli. But this idea that you are performing even just the kind of interpersonal rituals of listening. There's an offense, a kind of Amit has talked about in reference to his work, the presence effect. I think there's this kind of testimonial effect, this idea of you feel as if you're in the presence of somebody giving you testimony, or you feel like you are an interviewer asking an interviewee or a witness for their testimony, for their comments. Now, what was interesting was that Eva had not been in circulation for nearly as long. And so she hadn't had as many users asking her questions. And so the system was not as trained. And so people would ask Eva questions. I would ask Eva questions. And almost never was she giving a correct or even generically sufficient answer to those questions. So much that at one point the system broke down and they took her out of circulation because she just simply wasn't effective. And that it foregrounds this idea that Pinchas, because he's been circulating and gathering data, and his metadata has been structured and restructured and refined, and his data has been refined, that he, in essence, has become what I write about in my book as yet another form of an exemplary witness, someone who exemplifies not only the kinds of stories, whether it's the story of the sister, but also a kind of performance, the stoic yet sage, charismatic yet measured, reliable yet still emotional, objective, still highly subjective in his form of performance. And the system itself, the vocal recognition software, the AI and manual programming, fuels that exemplary status on his part. Dan?
Dan, you should unmute yourself, please.
Can I ask a question of our hosts? How much time do we have left?
We have about 20 minutes.
Okay. Why is this not
Wait,
showing?
does that include for your time or just for our presentation? Because I don't want to take out of Amit's.
The plan was to finish this panel at 30 past, so it's 20 minutes for everything.
Okay.
Including the discussion.
I see.
Okay.
So Dan, maybe we should compress for
Right.
sake of
Yeah. So how much? I'm sorry. I totally was.
20 minutes total. So we should probably begin to wrap it up.
I will compress. Okay. So anyway, this is, can you see that? This is my little graphic here of the last part. So one of the things I'm interested in about this is the idea that what I just alluded to is the idea that there's a sort of like functioning consciousness behind this. One of the things that happens with the reason Pinchas DIT is so much more user friendly than Eva is because he's been alive longer as a simulation. And one of the things that I was really interested in early on is Lacan's idea that, unconscious is structured like a language. And I've been doing quite a bit of work around cognitive science as a sort of counterpoint to psychoanalysis. And also I was really interested in the fact that psychoanalysis has become the sort of bad object of cognitive science, right? To use a psychoanalytic framework to look at cognitive science. But anyway, so this French neuroscientist, he said Lacan's wrong. Actually, the unconscious is structured like a decaying exponential, which what he means there is that as you learn, certain pathways in your mind of synapses are basically closed off, and the other ones become much more prominent and much more powerful. And those are your memories, right? So the reason you remember some things is because those pathways that were once there for those other experiences you had have been gotten rid of because they're not functional within the organism, right? On the other hand, is the parts that you do recall are those pathways that have been super strengthened. Well, the voice recognition software that functions behind Pinchevski is the same, in that the things that are asked repeatedly are pushed up in the sort of framework, and thus are the memories that are more recalled. Now, they do get a little bit of a help because the Shoah Foundation does emphasize certain memories over others. For instance, there was a wheelbarrow that I tried desperately to get Pinchas to understand my vocal patterns. And finally, when I did, I said, what was the most vivid memory you have? And he said, of the camps. And then he told me the story about Warsaw Ghetto, where the people had to collect the bodies and put them on wheelbarrows. Turns out that's nowhere, that's in the transcript, but it was nowhere in the database keyword indicator. And so I actually was at the Shoah Foundation one day throwing out keywords, and they were typing in the keywords so that he would have access to those memories. So the memories were actually in the database, but not in the keyword search. So if you wanted to learn about his experience with, and by the way, that was a vivid image, because he said this was this palpable image of death, right? You could see these people piled up, and of course the Jewish officers were meant to do it for the SS, right? Anyway, so this idea of the decaying exponential is key to the way of understanding how these things function. We'll skip this since we don't have time, but I do want to say this is Noah's thing he just talked about, which is in graphic form. It's an early drawing, so it's a little bit more crude, but this is Pinchas not responding. Every time we ask, it was like the wrong response. He's learned so much since then. And this is my graphic representation of what I'm talking about. So these are his memories on the right here. This is his sort of like camera versus person and his eyes. And there's all these memories he has, but there's this sort of puppet-like figure that's operating in the foreground that actually is the sort of interface by which you access these memories. And so some of the memories build up in strength. These are some that are quite distinct in the database. Others that fall by the wayside because they're just not, they're not as important. Obviously, it's where she is. The braid doesn't even need to be mentioned because it's so central to the whole thing. You don't even have to label it, it's just there. But some of these other things, these are places he's lived, which become part of the transcript, which by the way, nobody even knew he was in Cape Town or Tel Aviv unless you've read his biography, which I read, or his autobiography. But they're there in the transcript. It's just not accessible easily because no one knows to even ask about it, right? But these are places that he lived and formed his current self in a very strong way that determines the way he talks about his own past, right? I just want to show up something real quick. So as far as the Ava Schloss, at the Fisher Gallery in 2019, my son and I, who was at the time 11, he had to do a science report. So we went to the Fisher Gallery to look at the way in which this project was laid out. And he was fascinated by it. But what's interesting to me is because I'm a cartoonist, basically, of some sort. And this guy is a very photorealistic painter. And they got this gentleman to do paintings of these, of the two main figures. And then some other people that are also featured in the DIT. And this is Ava in this installation. So the way this one worked was, because of what Noah was just talking about, they were competing, they didn't work out well. So they had, at 1 o'clock, you can see Ava. At 3 o'clock, you can see Pinchas. And so they were alternating, which gives them sort of more chance to use their strengths, but also in the case of Ava, to build up her database so she can sort of talk more freely to the user. These are the questions that they suggested you ask. So it was still constrained about the idea of what you could possibly address to Ava. I have to say, at the museum, when we walked in, the museum people said, "Oh my gosh," to my son, you're going to lower the age level of everybody here. And it's true, when we got there, almost everybody was 70 or older, and my son was 11, so he brought the age way down. But when it came time to talk to Ava, the only person in the little theater that would ask her questions was my son. Everybody else felt very like they weren't able to do it. So then there's all these older people kind of encouraging my son to ask questions. So he was asking questions of Ava. And what's interesting to me is, again, back to this notion of the sort of way we treat these agents with sort of human characteristics. My son literally treated her like an older person that might need more help, more scaffolding, because she kept misunderstanding him. So instead of getting frustrated, he would rephrase his questions. So there was this sort of natural, the hierarchy between an older person and a younger person kind of worked with the technology to kind of help facilitate the conversation. But what he really liked was this wall. This is a full-size wall in the museum of all these Holocaust survivors painted in this sort of realistic painting style. And then on the side was this little monitor of the same painting that you could click on. That's my son's hand. You could click on and it would give you data about each of the people. And he was fascinated about it. Now he, of course, he's a coder. He loves coding and all this kind of technology stuff, but he was just fascinating. He would go through and read the whole thing. So you have this huge wall painting with this little representation. Now I have to say one thing, my son was really fascinated by this. Actually, it was less frustrating than the interactive, but somebody pointed out that this is old school technology. This is like from 40 years ago or something, right? This is stuff that when I was a kid would have been something you could probably have some kind of version of. But anyway, that was his experience. Oh, this is my last little, this is Pincus wondering about all this at some level. Anyway, so to end my section of it anyway, I think it's really interesting that in the end you have these sort of simulations, but one of the most gripping thing in this installation is old school technology, where you have a painting of people, you have a little representation of it, you can find out textual details about them in a fuller picture, because it's organized by a sort of like observing intelligence in some level, whereas the simulations are kind of constructed intelligence through the interaction of the user and the subject, but the context determines at what level that intelligence is going to be structured. And I will sign off with that.
And I would just say, by way of concluding, that one of the things I think we're trying to do is to shift the lens from testimony. Not that we should not look at these within the frameworks of testimony, but also within the framework of pedagogy, to situate it within a history of virtual agents, of pedagogical agents, both relating to and outside of the Holocaust. And I think a lot of the frustration and anxiety that comes with projects like the DIT is by looking at it through a testimonial framework, and the imperfections, the messiness, the inability in many ways that mirrors the aging survivors unable to adequately answer questions to living audiences. This also kind of engenders a kind of frustration. And in many ways, those kinds of frustrations are not as common when we look at video testimonies. We have the context, we have duration, we have narrative continuity. That's something that Amit can speak to. But I just want to conclude by saying what we're trying to suggest is, by kind of bringing histories of interactive pedagogy, by situating the frame on pedagogy, we can better understand how these kinds of virtual humans are being interacted with, how they're being mobilized. And if we shift that lens, I think it might be more productive to looking at some of the limits, but also the possibilities of this technology. But with that, I apologize for having gone over, and I want to thank you all for being such a great audience, and defer now to Amit for the questions.
Okay, thank you both very, very much. Great art, by the way. I wasn't expecting that. That was fantastic. We don't have much time, so I'll be very quick and allow other people also to speak. I'll just kind of bring us up to speed. I have like something like 12 questions, so I'll just have one then. Which actually goes to I think to the final point that Noah and actually Dan also you made, which is and it's related pretty much to everything you said, but to the fact that we can actually look at it as a pedagogical model rather than a testimonial one. And I wonder whether whether this is such a clear-cut distinction, or is it not a bit more complicated? First, because the project itself presents its kind of agenda as something that it's about time that we move away from or beyond what we know as, the traditional video testimony. And sometimes it's being framed as a way in which we need to like younger generation. They're like, they have short attention span. They like into technology. There's no way in which they will sit down and watch an hour or 2 hour testimony. So there is a lot of there's a number of assumptions that work behind this project, which does not really, I think, allow us very easily to just regard it as a pedagogical tool, because I think there is an agenda there to have a different model of testimony altogether, one that to a certain extent will replace other models because it's more effective, because it's more accessible and more interactive, and I would even say immersive. Regardless if it's three-dimensional or not, it works on an immersive premise in which you're part of it, you're participating in it. You're not as though quote unquote passive observer, as if there's such a thing. But anyway, so there are a lot of assumptions there at work. So I wonder whether or not this complicates the ability to regard it as a pedagogical tool.
I would say,
go ahead. Yeah. No, go ahead. I'm just saying that anybody who has any question, please raise your hands and we will collect them while we get the first response.
I mean, I would say, I say absolutely. I think that there is an institutional preference for these to be looked at, and a design that is positioning this as testimony. Initially, it's new dimensions in testimony. It's like a new form of testimony. And now it's been normalized as just yet another dimension in testimony, and that's still a part of it. I agree with that. And yet I think, I guess what I would suggest is by using pedagogy in concert with testimony. Of course, testimony has always served a pedagogical function. At the Fortunoff Archive, at the Shoah Foundation, testimonies have been used pedagogically since certainly even upon liberation, but even more, certainly much more germane, of course, to video testimony, starting in the late 70s with the Fortunoff Archive. So I think even within testimony in its videographic form, it's always intersected with pedagogy. So I think those are imbricated with one another, and I agree with that. What I'm suggesting, however, is that in terms of its situating how people understand and how they interact with and how we can better utilize this technology, bringing in pedagogy into the conversation, I think can allow us to kind of reshape our expectations a bit, and also not to set up our expectations to the same level that we would expect in terms of let's say, whether it's narrative continuity, in terms of duration, right? Those things of watching a testimony, it's in entirety or even in a large chunk. I think it's about kind of reading against or working against the grain of that institutional preference for testimony and bringing to it what I still think is ultimately, I know you say it's positioned and it's premised on immersiveness, an immersion, but there's something which, I've never really experienced, other than feeling like I'm in the presence of Pincus for a short moment, that sense of immersion, because there's just constant failures in the technology. There's the lighting, the layout, everything about the presentation kind of counters and inhibits that kind of immersion. And so I think kind of thinking of it in terms of pedagogy might be more productive to working through some of the imperfections, but also in terms of how we can use the system best in terms of curation, thinking of new ways rather than just presenting it as a sage on the stage, to use a concept that Dan talks about in his book. but placing him in situ, let's say, in a site or within an exhibition space, thinking of new ways of how we can mobilize this technology in a more kind of productive way, putting him in an exhibit in Lodz isn't, for instance, situated alongside other primary sources and artifacts. So I think combining the pedagogical with the testimony would enable us to think more productively of these uses, in spite of, against the institutional preferences. Dan, do you want to speak to that?
I just wanted to say, I have a more complicated notion of pedagogy, I must say, because, you know, pedagogy can never be untethered from learning, right? And basic notions of cognition is those two things together. And I would argue, this just to be provocative for a second, we're actually in a crisis of learning in the global community at the moment, which leads to a lot of the things we probably read about in the newspapers all day. And, you know, the idea of learning is sort of a structuring of consciousness. And so I actually sort of interested in the immersion idea because, you know, for years I never read fiction. I was really not much into fiction. I was really into essays and academic kind of work. And then suddenly I discovered fiction. I went, holy moly, you can actually submerge yourself into somebody's consciousness, right? And that person's been dead for like, what, 100 years or something, which I know is just naive and foolish of my part, but nevertheless, is the most immersive experience I've ever had is literally Proust, right? I mean, that experience of reading those long sentences that wind across pages. So I think that the notion of immersion, maybe at the moment, is has a more restricted, perhaps less imaginative notion of that, what that means. But having said that, I think that the experience of the breakdowns and the contradictions and all those kind of things in relation to technology, again, because of our natural, I mean, again, we are situated to see human responses and things. One of the major problems I have with my students is when I talk about the idea, are your animals evolved to be like you? And then they all go, no, they can think, they can understand me. And no, they can't. They literally are evolved to be like humans. That's why pets are the way they are. So the question, of course, is, do we see human attributes and everything? Yes, we do. And the question is, how much do we give to them? So even the breakdowns and even the little moments, like I said with my son, where Ava kind of didn't understand what he's saying, he then rephrased his question because he wanted Ava to give him attention, to give him an appropriate response. And we do it to lesser or more. And, you know, there's always skeptics, people that are like grumpy and don't want to do that, but even they fall into it. And that's what the Eliza software from the 1960s really showed, was that you can have a minimal human evidence of existence, and it can be read as a sort of human presence. And I think that's kind of a critical aspect of what the immersion is. Though I do have to say, as a pedagogy, the other part of it is the learning, right? So the context has to be there to provide the scaffolding so that you can have a more immersive experience because you know something about the context. And it shocks me how much, for instance, I tell the students that my earliest memory was the assassination of JFK, and they say, "You were born in 1945? No, I wasn't." But anyway, so.
Okay, good, great. Let's take a couple of questions. Okay, Todd.
Great, thank you.
Go ahead.
Hi, Amit. Hi, Noah. Hi, Dan. Also joining from Los Angeles. And I really appreciated the conversation this morning. And my question actually goes to some of the last things, Noah, that you were saying about Pincus becoming an exemplary witness in your sense, because he's learned so much. And this is a fascinating observation, because it really kind of bespeaks the machine learning algorithms that are running behind the training data, which Pincus has ingested over the last several years, right? So as more and more questions are asked over time, what's happening sort of under the hood is that the Shoah Foundation is using those questions as training data to create a model, a statistical model, that will better predict the answers that should be given for a given question, right? So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about sort of under the hood, the machine learning aspect. It's interesting connection with pedagogy, because you could ask, does the machine learning learn, right? And I guess it does, precisely because, there's a happening. Maybe it's learning in the sense that there's a curation process happening, saying, yes, this question is correct with that answer. This one's not so correct. This one's kind of correct, and so forth. But there's an extensive curation process, right? Where the training data then is fed in. And that, again, is what gives the better prediction of the right linkage between the question and answer. So anyways, can you say a little bit more about this process of becoming exemplary witness through machine learning?
Dan, I'll let you kind of take the first swing at that.
Let me take a swing. Whoop. So here's the one thing that really shocked me, that, it's the Google voice recognition software is what they're using, and it is quite commercial. And so it does have great, what's the word for it? Failings, I guess would be a good way of putting it. So like I said, I was sort of stunned when I went in. It was one of the times Noah was in Australia and I happened to be in LA. So I went over to talk to them, and we had some specific questions we wanted to ask them. So I brought the questions, and then literally for the entire day, I sat with one of the people at the Shoah Foundation, and they queried me for keywords that I gathered from reading the transcript. And then they entered those into the database. But what happens, so there's a two-part process. One is anything you already know about gets strengthened. So that all the times you ask about the braid or you ask about the camps or whatever, the general query becomes sort of a strengthened pathway. And so yes, those things are privileged. So popularity is a major part of that, but they have to be there in the first place. And they don't have the person power to do that. And so really it is up to people like myself or Noah or Todd or whoever to bring it to their attention that, wait, what about this aspect? And it may or may not be in the database. So the database, of course, being keyed off of the transcript. So it's actually got, I have to say, in that day sitting there with him, Pincus got, no, I shouldn't say, across the board, because we went through different agents. In fact, agents being one of the virtual humans. In fact, one of them, I said, oh, who's this woman? And they said, oh, watch this woman and you'll be interested in her. And I watched her, I said, oh, she's amazing. Why don't we see more of her? Oh, she doesn't test well with people. She's kind of brittle. She's a little grumpy. Well, I actually found that quite lovely. I was very happy that she was grumpy and she was a little angry. Oh gosh, right? She was a little angry, but she didn't test well with audiences. So she didn't become one of the main people, like the exemplary witness that Noah's talking about. But even though that day with me there, suddenly their database got much larger, because here I was just asking what I thought were obvious questions, and those became keywords. And she would actually type in like, okay, so you're saying wheelbarrow. What are other ways we can phrase that? And I say, well, bodies or whatever. So there was all these key, so it broadened out, and they literally said, we don't have time to be sitting down and doing. So what we do is we take the data that we get from the sites, we try to massage it, but then we also have to do one-to-one interaction with people who've used it to find out what their frustrations were. So it's really a kind of multi-part process, but the machine learning is essentially, the Google agent, and it works from the Google software. So, whatever generic, broad, popular set of keywords works in the voice recognition that they have, and they build off of that. So I don't know if that answers.
And I just quickly would add to that then even within the design, just let alone outside of the vocal recognition software, in terms of the interview itself, which was interesting to address, Todd, thank you for your question, is this idea that you would ask multiple variations of the same question, and you would ask for short versions and long versions. So already, and this builds on what Amit has already written about in his book, which I highly recommend and has really informed a lot of the work that we're doing, is on, I think he's absolutely right in terms of this movement from preservation and reception to an emphasis on reception. That design they use this term, this is user driven editing. It's geared towards trying to make the data as accessible as possible. Now, of course, in practice, that is not the case. But there we go. In its design, intended to try to find, for precisely the kind of audience that you referred to, Amit, let's say shorter attention span, shorter, more compact answers. So you have a compact version of his story of his sister. You have a longer version of the story of his sister, and they're tagged accordingly. So embedded in the design, not in its practice always, but in the design is that attempt to try to funnel certain kinds of questions to certain kinds of audiences, to certain kinds of users. But as Dan says, that gets garbled along the way.
Can I add one thing that maybe seems tangential, but seems important to me? Their latest project is William Shatner. I just want to point that out.
Yeah, well,
So I mean,
but of course.
Right. So there's kind of a movement towards this sort of entertainment model as well, right? So
Well,
something to think
it's
about.
been there from the beginning, I think. We don't have much time, so I think
So
we'll
we
have.
we can take a few more questions and
Okay, so we
and
have two
start
that
the second session. It's just I see
Okay.
Henry Greenspan and I have
All right,
this-
so let's take the two that I know of, which the first is Carol and then is Henry, and then we'll see if we have more time. Okay. Okay,
Thanks.
Carol.
Thank you so much. This was fascinating. I'll try to be very brief. So I'm just, I'd like to talk for a moment about Noah referred to the word iteration, and this word fascinates me also because recently we had our own Zoom conference in anthropology, and there was a philosopher, anthropologist, more philosopher perhaps, Jared Zigon, talking about iteration as ethical work. So I would just say iteration in IT mediation seems to me as something, once it is a product, a platform working, it has its limitations. In other words, the iteration, is perhaps there's a change because of, as you say, circulation. There's a change in terms of changes in harvesting, perhaps, as the program platform learns, and responds. But when, what I hear in what Noah is saying about the eyes as lenses, I feel as if there's in human real offline iteration, there's more of a emotion work, embodiment, and this possibility for the self to respond in surprising ways. And that the idea of iteration is fascinating because that means presence surprises us. So it's not only about presence or absence, but in the space in between, there are so many possibilities. So just a quick thought about the word and what it kind of articulates for me. Thank you.
No, I would agree. I think in that I mean, Amit talks about presence, references the presence effect. I think, as I mentioned, the testimonial effect. I do think it generates, there is this kind of embodied charge. And with that, I think comes an ethical, as you mentioned, an ethical obligation to tend to that. And I think in that sense, I don't think it's training one to be empathic or ethical, but it demands, and I think in that sense gets back to Amit's perspective about testimony. And in that sense, that's where exactly testimony comes back in, where whether or not we want, whether or not it is or is not testimony, I'm less interested in that in terms of its, semantically, but it does, I think, require at least or obliges us to tend to it with a different kind of ethical obligation. As an utterance that demands or requires our presence, even if it's just our gaze or perhaps the nodding of our head. So I think what you're picking up on is very strong, and that's something that resonated with us, which is, I think, one of the reasons why we've been writing about this project, is because it still has that kind of embodied ethical imperative inscribed within it.
I mean, I was going to say, iteration is the idea is the iteration of Pinchas Guter, who's living, is passing away. And so the question is, do you lose that sort of presence, or can you somehow, like, I kind of shiver at the idea of harvest, but you sort of reconstruct that idea of what that person was at some level. And I think that's actually a laudable goal. And I think it's, I've looked at a lot of people coming in and doing talks in schools and things, and they're certainly not, they're not infallible either, right? They come in and say all sorts of stuff that is, either credible or incredible or whatever. But they're still kind of given a sort of level of respect in relation to the sort of consciousness that's behind it. And I kind of feel like these kind of immersive experiences, like Thucydides, writings from the Greek time, it sort of can speak further forward. And the presence effect of a technology kind of has that at a different level, right? So I'm not sure that it's something unique in that regard, but.
Thank you. Just worried
Thank
about
you.
the time.
Yes, Henry, go ahead. Thank you.
Yes, hi. Good to see everybody. I just want to say, I was really intrigued by what Noah said about in which format is Pincus more, quote, real? And I think of my own students, we've been watching the 95 video testimony for years in my class. And that is extremely interactive, the way we do it. Maybe because they've been propagandized by me, but it's because the students identify with the interviewer and not necessarily positively. They want to, wait a minute, why did he stop Pincus there? Why didn't he ask this? Wait a minute, he's not a camera. He just said he's not a camera. So they are very much engaged in that process and have their own questions that they would have chosen, the questions they wish had not been done, or the timing. Whereas watching the DIT, in my experience, they are more distant in some respects than engaged relative to the video testimony, which is just an interesting, to me, phenomenon. I'm not sure what to do with it pedagogically.
The DIT needs you to be there. Right?
Well, I guess it does, but I mean, yes, the whole notion of the show is that it is a more direct.
Wait, so we need to render you, Hank, we need to render you as a DIT to be alongside each of the avatars.
I'm ready, man.
And I say that as your former student. I mean, I think that's exactly. We'll approach Stephen Smith, and we'll get this rig out to Ann Arbor as soon as we can.
It's scary. It's really scary.
No, but I do think that you're right. I mean, of course, even with Shoshana Feldman talking about interacting with testimony, in the classroom, right? Crisis in the classroom. I mean, the interactivity of classroom viewing, this is not new to DIT, right? This is not new to Holocaust testimony. This is been written about since the 70s and 80s.
Indeed, I really want to talk the fact of the interviewer being present in the video testimony creates a kind of interaction that may not be there in the DIT, because students engage with the interviewer and what they perceive anyway as the interviewer's mistakes.
Because they're projecting themselves as the interviewer in this case. They are not.
What they wish.
The interviewer is not. You don't hear Stephen Smith talking. You become the kind of interpolated, vision of Stephen Smith asking these questions. You're trying to match yourself with Stephen Smith, the interviewer, who's already anticipated future users.
And
so,
they want to be. Yeah.
So anyway, thank you, Hank, for that. Yeah.
Do we have time for more questions?
There was one question about how Achinoam asked how they choose the people, the protagonists, so to speak, that to do it, like a Pinchas Guterman like this, or this other woman, or because it's probably a lot of thoughts goes to who they're going to be choosing.
Pincus was friends with Stephen Smith, right? So that's part of the process, right?
And you had to be physically able to withstand the heat of the lights, wearing, this is intense heat, it's intense endurance, physical endurance. You've had to give testimony before. So already, I mean, you've had to give a story that has some sort of, like everything the Shaw Foundation does, to its, both to its credit, and some of the limitations of it is, nothing goes unexamined in terms of finding out who would be the best performer, and even that doesn't always come across. Who would be the most effective storyteller? I think in terms of modes of performance, in terms of the uniqueness of their story. So Eva Schloss being the stepsister of Anna Frank is in itself, like that's we will get as close as we can to Anne Frank through Eva Schloss. So I think the uniqueness of story, mode of performance, proximity to the institution and the archive in some way. I think it's expanding, though, to its credit, and I'm sure there will be less instances of these kinds of necessarily exemplary survivors, though of course time is running out.
Do we have time for one last question? Yes. So
there's a question coming from. I'm just looking at it. There it is. This is from Mehak, whom I know is driving, so I'll be reading on her behalf. She's asking, the PTSD syndrome through Lionel's definition of unconscious.
Can you say that again?
Yeah, I didn't quite catch that.
Can we explain the PTSD syndrome through Lionel's definition of unconscious? She means Lionel, yeah.
Yeah.
The French neuroscientist.
Well, it's interesting because I had a clip that I was going to show, then I decided I didn't want to mess with audio, but there's actually a reciprocal, back to the thing I said about William Shatner. One of the things with the ICT is they were founded by I think it was the Army said, we want to create a thing like the holodeck from Star Trek: The Next Generation. Can you do it? And they said, yes, we can. So USC hired the producer of Paramount's Star Trek: The Next Generation to be the director, the founding director of the ICT. And so they actually had this built-in thing about entertainment as part of the process, right? So I have a clip that's from Rizzoli and Isles, I think it's called. It's some crime drama from one of the TV networks. And they have in it, they're showing the software and they say, what's this? This is virtual PTSD therapy. Look at it. And then the guy puts on the headset, he goes, this is too real. And the other soldier goes, it's okay, man. It's my experience, not yours. You know, and then it goes like, yeah, man, this is real. And then it goes, and so it's in the middle of this TV show, right? The reason I say that is because one of the things about the PTSD is it's actually a strengthening of certain pathways, and the idea of the habitual response you have from this traumatic event actually is that idea of there's certain pathways that have been shut off. And so that the software in some way is trying to build up other sort of like prospects of understanding this experience that puts it into sort of a box that puts it outside of yourself. And so the idea is, like the original training was really meant to make you at least a little bit understanding what it likes to be in a combat situation. In fact, there was this general who said, you know, apparently cadets, like people in the combat, die most often within the first 6 months. So he said, if we can get them to survive the first 6 months, we can probably get our troops to live past X, you know, amount of time. So the reason is it sort of creates a sort of foundational understanding of the experience you're in. And the idea about the PTSD is if you can create a sort of way of boxing the experience off as a sort of separate entity, you can sort of push it away from yourself in some level, right? And so by experiencing this, you're building a different set of pathways in relation to that experience. They say they've had good results with it, but I haven't seen any of the data. I've read some of the papers which had stuff attached, but the idea of this sort of defamiliarizing of the experience into a different context lessens the sort of body responses of the PTSD. That's what they're working on. And so there's a kind of a relationship between what the French neuroscientist said about the idea of the decaying.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I guess we'll let Noah go to sleep and then has to drive. So thank you very much. We'll take a break until 6 o'clock. So we'll start a bit late, the second part about the fabric of trauma. And there will be, I hope, some time for a few questions at the end that maybe we'll tie with Amit and myself, the two panels. Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we will reopen at 6 o'clock. Okay.
Thank you. Good
So
night.
everyone needs a short break. Thank you so much.
Bye.
And we'll be in touch and send you the recording.
Thank you.